Morning. So just housekeeping. This is week 5. It feels like week 5 for me. Week 6 is the last lesson in this series, but if you have anything that you want to be taught on or preached on, just let me know. Over the last couple of years, I have a note in my phone. It's called Sermon Sparks. And whenever I get an idea for a sermon, I put it in there. So I've got like 50 or 60 things that we can learn from. But if there's something specific, I've already had a couple of requests that to teach on. But if there's something specific you want to hear, just let me know and we can kind of work through that. I can't guarantee I'll get to it right away, but we'll work through it as we go. Yesterday I was looking at a video, and it was from 4 years ago. There was this young man that had been convicted of murder, and he was standing in the courtroom and he was addressing the jurors, but he was also addressing the family members in the courtroom. And out of the corner of the camera, you can see this guy just rushing across the courtroom, and he ends up tackling this young man, and that individual was the father of the kid that was murdered. And I was trying to think through that situation, what might be going through his head, because as a father, I probably would want to do the same thing. And he was at the point where he had so much grief in his life, and at this situation, he had to take control of it. He felt he did anyway. And he ended up tackling him, and as you can imagine, the guards and everybody rushed over and pulled him off this individual. But I think of that video, and I think of a situation where it's hopeless, right? There's no repair for what had happened in your life. And the story that we're going to look at this morning, we have Ezekiel who is sitting in the valley, and he's given this picture of hopelessness, right? Last week we looked at Nehemiah, and we know that his brother came to him, gave him some news around Jerusalem. The walls were broken, the gates were burned, his countrymen were in shame. And he was going through a period of roughly around 4 months of, it first started off with grief. And that grief, through prayer, he came up with a plan, and he was able to start that execution. We're going to look at the final story next week of Nehemiah. But this week we're going to be in Ezekiel. But if you look at what Ezekiel is being put into in Ezekiel chapter 37, which is where we're going to spend our time today, he's in this middle of this valley, and this is the picture that I'm trying to convey up here. It's going to be very dry. It's going to be quiet, no wind, no sound, a wide open valley. And you can imagine scattered across the floor, there's bones everywhere, just bleached by the sun. They haven't been recently slain because it says that they were very dry. So they've been sitting there for a long time. This is something that hasn't happened in a recent time. And God's going to make Ezekiel walk through all of these bones and see the hopelessness of this situation. And I think God does this because he knows that Ezekiel can't really appreciate what God's going to do unless he really sees the circumstances. So again, last week Nehemiah went through grief, but this week we're going to look at what goes beyond grief. What happens when we get to the point that we don't feel like there's any hope? We don't see the situation changing. It's a place where you conclude that it's not just broken, it's beyond repair. But before we go too far, the anchor verse in our series, if you want to read it with me, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7 says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not us." So this point, we need to remember it because we are just jars of clay. The real power comes from God and the things that he can do, and we're going to see that today in Ezekiel. So the question we want to look at this morning is, what do we do when something we love looks like it's beyond saving? What happens when our grief turns into resignation? Do we stop asking because the bones in our life are very dry and they can't be resurrected? And what we're going to see throughout this is that God's answer is a rattling answer. It's breath-filled and it's army-raising. So, the scene that God is showing Ezekiel, he's asking Ezekiel to walk through it back and forth before he does what he's going to do. So in Ezekiel chapter 37, I'm going to read 1 through 2, and it says in verse 1, "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he led me around among them, and behold, there was very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry." So God didn't warn Ezekiel. He didn't shield him from what he was about to see. He didn't summarize anything. God led him back and forth among them, and he saw a great many bones on the valley floor. And I don't think this was so Ezekiel would despair. I think this was because God wanted Ezekiel to understand how hopeless that situation would look, right? He wanted him to understand that this was something that had been gone a long time and it was dead. It says, it's interesting words there. It says very dry. So we know that this wasn't fresh deaths. It wasn't a recent battlefield. It had been long gone. No flesh, no moisture. Nothing showed any sense that it had happened recently. And God chooses this vision for Ezekiel for something that had been dead for a very, very long time. And there might be situations in our own life where they are not recent ones. They are very dry ones. They have things that we've hoped for a very long time. We've asked for a very long time. They've been long disappointed that we didn't see the results that we wanted in our own lives. Those are the kind of bones that God will rattle. And I don't want you to name it out loud, but I want you to think to yourself, do I have a very dry place in a valley in my own life right now? Is it something that you used to pray for that you stopped praying for? A relationship that you used to believe in but you don't have any hope in it anymore? A part of yourself that used to think that God could do this, but you've accepted that it can't? It could be part of this church. It could be part of the community that we live in. It could be part of this nation that we live in. Where once we thought God would do something about it, but we no longer expect him to move. And what God says in the next verse is very specific for our own dry places in our lives. So we think about Ezekiel. He's standing in the middle of this valley. God asks him one question. One question. And I think everything hinges upon how Ezekiel's going to answer this question. Verse 3. "And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, you know." I'm reading from the ESV as it says, and it uses the words sovereign Lord, O Lord God, you know. But the NIV, I think, uses a really good translation as well. It says, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. So he asked Ezekiel first, and I think he wanted Ezekiel to say it out loud. And I think that's God's way of getting this prophet to participate in the hope that he would see when he witnessed the miracle that was about to take place. I don't think I think Ezekiel's answer, he didn't say, "No, Lord, those bones can't live." He didn't say that. If he did, that would be denying God's power. The question is, can these bones live? And how should we be answering that question? We should always be answering that question with yes. God can do anything that he wants to do. So we know that God can raise these dry bones, and I don't think Ezekiel doubted that for a moment. But Ezekiel was being asked something deeper than if God could do it. What he was being asked was, can God do it? But he was asking in the sense to give Ezekiel hope for what God would do. Here in this valley, with these particular bones that he's looking at on that specific day, but what God would do here and now, that is the part with Ezekiel's response that he didn't presume to know. So his answer, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know," it's brilliant, right? What he's saying is, "Yes, Lord, I know you can. But whether you will here and now, that is yours to decide." So, having faith is having full confidence in what God can do. Faith is a humble surrender to what God will do. Faith trusts that what is impossible for us is possible with God. But it leaves the outcome in God's hands. We talked about a few weeks ago, God can do much with little, but we need to be putting it into his hands. And Ezekiel doesn't pretend to know the answer to the outcome. He gave the answer to the one who asked the question. But he never wavered on what God can do. He left it up to God what he would do. And I don't think this is, and I've done this in my own life, I don't think this means that we have to have a fake faith where we pretend that we know the outcome of what God's going to do and call that faith. That's not what we're saying. I don't think we have to muster the kind of courage and certainty about an outcome and then call it faith. That's what I'm saying. But I think what we do need to do is everything in us needs to understand that God can do it. That's the question. We know that God can. So it applies when you think about a marriage that is too far gone, or a foolish person that you've been praying for, the diagnosis, the addiction, whatever that bone dry place is in your heart, remember that God can resurrect it. But the outcome of it, what he will do here in your valley on those dry bones, the answer that we need to be giving is the same answer that Ezekiel gave. Sovereign Lord, you alone know. So here in the next couple of verses, in verse 4, God did something that he wouldn't have expected. He asked Ezekiel to speak to the dead. It says in verse 4, "And then he said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause the flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you. And you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord." So sinews here, those are the tendons, the tough cords that attach your muscle to bone. It's what's really holding you together. Without them, you'd just be a big pile of bones, probably very similar to on this valley floor. I think if you look at it from the perspective that God here is going to reconnect something that has been disconnected. Bone to bone, tendon to muscle, skin over flesh, and he starts by working his way from the inside out. And it's interesting that he tells Ezekiel, he doesn't say, go collect the bones, don't analyze the bones, don't grieve over the bones. He says, speak to them, prophesy to those bones, say it out loud what God's going to do. Talk to the dead, speak to the silent, declare to that very dry what God has already decided. In verse 7 it says, so I prophesied as I was commanded, and I prophesied there was a sound, and behold, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. So imagine you're standing there as Ezekiel, you're obeying this really strange command. You start seeing all these bone fragments come together, there's rattling. At that point you're thinking, this is chaotic. You don't know what's going on. But you know that God's in control of that situation. But it sounds like things are getting worse because you hear all this noise. Before God does something new in our life, quite often, not always, but quite often, there's a rattling in our life. There's a shaking, there's a disruption. It's more noisier and uncertain than it was before. And our instinct as humans is to panic through that situation. We interpret that chaos, that sound, as things falling apart. But what if that rattling was the sound of God putting something back together? What if that sound was God resurrecting something? Verse 8, I looked, and the tendons and the flesh appeared on them, and the skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. So bone, then tendon, then muscle, then flesh, not all at one time. God doesn't snap it into place. We see it happening in stages, right? Starting from the inside out. And sometimes when we look at God in our own lives, do we expect it to happen just like that? We do. But it happened here in stages. Sometimes we don't see the entire picture, but God knows what that entire picture is. But we need to trust the rattling. And it's interesting to notice that when all of those things had happened, all of those stages were being put together, those individuals still had something missing inside, didn't they? They were just bodies laying there. There was no breath inside of them. In the last half of verse 8, it says, there was no breath inside of them. But in verse 9, he says, then he said to me, prophesy to the breath, and prophesy, son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So we have this picture of the bodies were complete, but there's still no breath inside of them. God tells Ezekiel to prophesy again. He tells them to not just prophesy to the bones as he did earlier. He tells them to prophesy to the breath. I haven't seen it in a while. I think there's a video on Ruach, which is the word here for breath. I think the Bible Project has a video on that. It's been a while since I looked at it, but this is the Hebrew word. It has, three things to it. There's a breath component to it. There's a wind component to it. There's a spirit component to it. This is the same word that's used in Genesis when we have the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And that same word is used throughout the Old Testament many times. And so when God tells Ezekiel to prophesy to the breath, he's telling him to prophesy to the Spirit. It's the Spirit of the living God that's going to enter these bodies. It's the same Spirit that came over creation that is now breathing in the valley of these bones. So it says in verse 10, "So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, an exceedingly vast army." So not a few people, not a survival remnant. This is a vast army. And if you were to be thinking about the time frame of this situation, you have Ezekiel sitting in this valley maybe an hour earlier, but now we have this vast army standing in this valley. That's what God's breath does. It takes something that is dead and it resurrects it. So in verses 11 through 14, we can see that these bones represent the entire house of Israel. They were saying, "Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone and we are cut off." But God's response is, "I will open your graves. I will bring them up from them, and I will put spirit in you and you will live." So God doesn't dismiss their assessment about saying to them that you're wrong, that these things are not that bad. He says, or they said, our hope is gone. But God answers, "I'm going to put my spirit in you and you will live." He enters that hopelessness and he breathes life into it. So, what does this mean for our own very dry places in our life? Those are the areas where you've stopped asking God for help. Those are areas where you've written off. You've sat in the valley and waited for that last bone to be covered up by that dry sand. But here's God's question to Ezekiel. Can these bones live? Focus on the can part. My hope is that you'll say to that very dry place, to those bones in your life, "Yes, Lord, I know those bones can live." But for the will part of that question, will you, Lord, in this specific time, in this place? Only you alone know. That's the answer we should be giving. The same answer that Ezekiel gave. Because God does not depend on your certainty, but on how you think the outcome will be. He doesn't depend on that. It depends on his breath. So, this morning, 3 things I want you to walk away with. What looks dead is never dead to God. The valley was very dry. It didn't matter. God breathes life wherever he wants. The second one, the rattling is not always the sound of things breaking. Sometimes it's the sound of God building. So, if your life or your church feels noisier and more uncertain than it used to, do not assume the worst. God often assembles in the middle of what seems like chaos. And the third thing, God doesn't need your certainty. He needs your obedience. So Ezekiel did not know or didn't have to know how it would work. He just had to obey God and prophesy to those very dry bones. And this is not a formula, so some of you have prayed faithful prayers in the past. They were not answered the way that you had hoped. That is real. That is painful. I'm not dismissing that. But speaking that life is not a formula. It's an act of trust. So praying for your marriage when nothing changes because you trust the God you are talking to. Showing up and serving in this church when the walls look broken. saying to your soul, I'm going to trust God with this, but continue to do the next faithful thing. So you don't have to know the outcome. You just have to obey where God has told you to obey and trust him with the rest of it. Isaiah in chapter 40, verse 28 through 31 says, have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength, and they shall mount up with wings like eagles, and they shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. So the same God who breathed over Ezekiel's valley is the God who renews strength. He does not patch people up. He renews them like the bones and the muscles and the tendons and the bodies that were in that valley. He brings them back to life. He renews them. He takes what has been weary and gives them wings like that eagle. What has been faint in our own lives, he gives endurance. That's the same God of resurrection. That's the same God of those dry bones. That's the same God today. So if you are standing in a valley and it feels very dry, lift up your eyes. The same God who does not grow tired is about to breathe what you have written off in your life. What stands up out of your valley doesn't survive, it soars. So this morning, if you're struggling and you need help, we're here to help you. Come forward, make it known. Help us to help you. If you have dry places that you don't feel like you can get help with, I would encourage you to meet with someone privately about it. I want you to speak life out loud to yourself over that very dry place in your life. You don't have to know how God will do it, but you have to have confidence that he can do it. In Hebrews, we can approach the throne of grace with confidence and receive mercy and grace in our time of need. John says that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. You're not approaching a reluctant father or a reluctant God. That God is already leaning in, wanting to hear it. So you need to come with boldness. You need to come with trust. You need to do what Ezekiel did and open your mouth and say, come, breath of God. Breathe on what looks dead. I trust the one who assembles armies out of dust. That is prophesying, approaching God with confidence. He invites you to participate in the hope that is before you. And that same Spirit who moved over the valley of dry bones is active and alive in this room this morning. He hasn't forgotten about your valley. So, again, if you're struggling, I would encourage you to come forward. If you need help, talk to us privately. We're here to help you. I'd ask you to stand as we sing the song of invitation.